Okay, so the start of question 4 is recall about how ionization works. So all we're saying here is that a high energy photon can remove electrons from molecules in living cells, like DNA, and exposure to ultraviolet radiation produces ions which can damage living cells. So that's just a description of the process of ionization, and you have to learn it. There's no substitute for doing that. You should also remember that we can also remove electrons from individual atoms as well as from whole molecules. So they could have put atom in there instead, and it still would have been okay. Right, next thing then is a bit about the electromagnetic spectrum and how ionization works. Ultraviolet radiation can damage living cells, but radio waves of the same intensity cannot. And there's a clue in the previous part here, because it says high energy photons. And if you remember, the electromagnetic spectrum has a high energy end and a low energy end. And the high energy is gamma rays, and the low energy is radio waves. So the ultraviolet is close enough to the high end, it goes down gamma, X-ray, ultraviolet, that it's ionizing. But radio is right at the other end. So the photons of radio waves have very, very little energy. So that first statement is true, and it is in fact the correct answer, is the explanation. If you're doing one of these questions where it's only tick the box, which means one box, you should also look at the other alternatives just to check. Here, radio waves are not part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Well, that's just not true, so it can't be the correct answer. Radio waves do not consist of photons. Again, that's not true, because all of the electromagnetic spectrum consists of photons. And radio waves have too high a frequency. Well, radio waves are also at the low frequency end of the spectrum, so that one seems unlikely as well. So even if you weren't sure about the photons, the only box that makes sense is the top one, because the others are all just incorrect. Always look for those sort of ways you can just get rid of the options that don't make any sense. Okay, part C is asking about the hole in the ozone layer. So the ozone layer of the North Pole becomes thinner. There are increased health risks to people in the area shown on the diagram inside this circle. Okay, describe and explain one way in which the people living in this area can reduce these risks. Well, the first thing to realise is what the risks are. The ozone layer absorbs ultraviolet, so if there's a hole in it, that means there's going to be more ultraviolet reaching the ground. And that is risks of skin cancer and sunburn, increased risk of skin cancer and sunburn. So the ways in which we can protect against that are wearing clothing or using sunscreen. And both of those will be explained by the fact that the clothing or the sunscreen absorbs the ultraviolet radiation. So when you get this describe and explain question here and you see 2 marks, almost certainly it will be 1 mark for describe and 1 mark for explain. So there's your answer. Sunscreen or clothing because of the absorption. You're also allowed reflection. The clothing will reflect ultraviolet. Sunscreen doesn't. It absorbs it. It allows the word blocks here in the mark scheme, but you want to try and avoid words like that because it's not proper scientific language. Absorbs is much better. Blocks won't always be allowed. Sometimes if they're asking a particular question, they wouldn't allow block. You'd have to use the word absorb. So make sure you use the right language when you're doing that. And the last part of the question here is one of these join the boxes up. Don't make the mistake of trying to join all the boxes to one on the other side. It says use one straight line in bold. So all we're doing is joining one box on the left to one box on the right to give the correct explanation for what happens when ultraviolet radiation hits the ozone layer. So what happens is, we know that the ozone layer absorbs ultraviolet, so we really need to start with that top box. And what it does is it produces a chemical change. The absorption of ultraviolet actually turns the ozone, the O3, into oxygen, O2. That shouldn't be surprising because one of the things you need to learn about ionizing radiation in general is that the ions it produces can lead to further chemical reactions. And that's what's happening here. Okay, the other 2 boxes don't really make any sense. The absorption of ultraviolet can't be responsible for the hole in the ozone layer, because otherwise the hole will just get bigger all the time. Okay, and the ultraviolet sends all of the ultraviolet radiation away from Earth doesn't really make any sense either. So again, just by a process of elimination, kind of the only one that makes logical sense is the middle box, even if you weren't sure. So be on the lookout for that sort of thing.